Well, good morning, everybody. We got another little adventure today. This one is going to be along the Thames, and I am starting here. This is Woolwich. This is, as you can see on the sign behind me, the Royal Arsenal Gatehouse, which is obviously what Woolwich is most famous for. The most famous site in Woolwich is the Royal Arsenal. It's produced armaments for the British Army and Navy, but mostly the Army, for about 3 centuries. So it was originally built on a site that had been a domestic warren, where they grew rabbits in the Tudor era. Grew rabbits? You don't grow rabbits. Where they raised rabbits, that's the one. I always mix up agriculture and husbandry. It's a good job I wasn't around at the birth of farming, really. It was originally built on a site. I'm just going to step back into the shade a little bit. It's a bit sunny out here. There we go. This was originally built on the site of a domestic warren, and it was called the Warrens for many years until 1805, when it gets renamed the Royal Arsenal. It's just down the road, so just over in that direction, I believe, is the Woolwich Dockyard, which was built by Henry VIII for his ship to build his flagship, the Henri Grâce à Dieu. Grâce à Dieu, the Henry, blessed be to God. No ego problems there at all. The arsenal here started producing arms in the 17th century, the late 17th century. In 1720, the Master Gunner of Great Britain took charge of of 2 artillery regiments that would eventually go on to form the Royal Artillery. The Corps of Engineers was also based around here. 1787, that eventually becomes the Royal Engineers, the sappers that still exist to this day. The military units stay at the arsenal for about 100 years or so. After 1800, they move over to Woolwich Common. 1805, George III names it the Royal Arsenal. He says, well, why not just call it the Royal Arsenal rather than the Warrens, which doesn't really explain what it does, because we don't grow rabbits here anymore. He was insane, remember, so presumably he would have gotten away with that, where I wouldn't. I say gotten, sorry, he would have got away with that. So there's a great big expansion in the Napoleonic era. Obviously, much greater need for arms and armaments there. So there's a massive expansion of the arsenal there in manufacturing, and you start getting really some of the great recognisable engineering names that you might have heard of. People like Mark Isambard Brunel, the father of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who will appear shortly. There's a little teaser for you there. And also people like William Congreve, who invented the Congreve rocket, which was one of the first rocket artillery pieces that was used to great effect by the British Empire in its conquest around the world, inspired by similar things they'd seen in India and around China. So after Waterloo, the number of workers plummets. It goes down to about 1/10 of its former number, only about 500 people. It had been about 5,000. There's another big build-up again a little bit later in the 19th century around the Crimean War, and then again it shrinks, and that's really the story of this part of London, of the Arsenal in particular, is very much this cycle of a lot of growth and then shrinking down again. The other most famous thing from around here, presumably, is Arsenal Football Club. If you're a football fan, this is where the Arsenal Football Club was founded by workers from the Arsenal, and obviously it moved to its to various other sites in the interim. I can't even remember where it's based now. Gunnersbury, somewhere like that, anyway. World War I comes around again. We see that cycle again. You go up to 80,000 people working at Woolwich Arsenal there in the manufacture of arms and ammunition and armaments. At that point, it covers about 1.3 square kilometres of production. But between the wars and the interwar period, they realised that actually there's a big problem, which is that this area is incredibly exposed to bombing, a point which is proved. So they move a lot of the manufacturing away, most of it even away, and there's a few experimental facilities and a little bit of light arms manufacturing around here, but not that much. And their point is proved precisely on the 7th of September in 1940, where this area around Woolwich is hit very heavily in the Blitz. which does its damage, but it doesn't destroy it entirely, and in fact manufacturing of armaments continues here until about 1967, and the military establishment here lasts even longer than that. The military establishment here doesn't close until 1994, at which point Woolwich is entirely returned to civilian hands. But you can see, I mean, this is the Beresford Gates. This is the main warehouse on Beresford Square, but you can see, I mean, the legacy, it's one of those places where the legacy really lives on. So just over here is a pub, the Ordnance, the old gun pit, and there's lots of things around here that are have things in common like that. So yes, that's where we're starting. We're starting in Woolwich. We're going to go through the whole history of London down the Thames, and yes, next up, well, we'll leave it as a surprise until I get there. So I shall see you very shortly. Well, everybody, hello and welcome to Stop 2 on the little Petit adventure we're going on today. And the Stop 2 is here. This thing here, which for those, the uninitiated, is the Thames Barrier. Now, the Thames Barrier is London's primary flood defence. But before we get into the Thames Barrier, we should possibly look at what makes London such a good place to have a capital city. Why is it the capital, and why has it historically always been the sort of key capital and key economic heartland of Britain, all the way back to the Romans? It has been the core economic venue. So London is so good as a capital because it is the lowest bridging point on the Thames River, and the Thames goes all the way up towards into Oxfordshire. So it's there's a sign, in fact, over there that says we are 180 miles from the source of the Thames. But as well as being the lowest bridging point, so you can easily cross it, you can easily build around it, it is also a place where you can bring big ships quite close to the centre of the city. You can, in fact, see one over there next to the Tate and Lyle sugar factory, although given how rusty that ship is, I don't think I'd want to be eating any sugar that has come off it. I suppose you call it brown sugar, demerara, if it's got rust flakes in it, to try and disguise it. But anyway, so yes, so that's why it is. It's the low bridging point, and you can get the ships up to it. But low bridging points, of course, come with a secondary problem, which is if you have very low banks, very low spaces on the river, you are going to get flooding. And this has been a problem throughout history, often particularly because the Thames is tidal. You get big tidal bore comers in, and it can cause quite a lot of damage. Now, this was a problem throughout history, but it wasn't until 1954 when they actually decided to really have a look at doing something about it. So just before 1954, there had been some massive floods up in sort of Northumbria, Northumberland, that sort of area in the north of England. And they had caused a hell of a lot of damage and been very problematic. And typical Westminster, it says, floods in Northumberland. Ooh, what about if London flooded? That'd be a problem, wouldn't it? So yes, so playing into the narrative even in the 50s there. Yes, so they establish the Waverley Committee in 1954 to look at the problem of flooding in London and the Thames. And the Waverley Committee reports back, and it recommends that flood defences are built. Flood defences, it says, in the form of a barrier. Now, this barrier, which is eventually the one they recommend building, isn't built until 1974 because of various, it's mostly local government shenanigans about who has to build it. It's also quite an inconvenient thing to build because obviously you're essentially blocking the Thames while you are building it, and there's a lot of river traffic going up and down. So they actually start, I believe, on that far side, and they build a few of these little towers, and then they build across from this side to meet it. So it costs £461 million back in 1974. That's about 1.23 billion now, depending on how you manage it. So it is a very high-value public infrastructure project. It's first operated, the whole thing, in 1982, and then it officially opens in 1984. Nice little sailing ship going by. Anyway, first operated and then opened by the Queen in 1984. And since then, it's done sterling service. Now, the way it operates is actually quite interesting because it's basically, imagine taking a soup can and cutting it lengthways in half. That's basically how the Thames Barrier works. It has half cylinders, and in their sort of flat position, when you don't need the barrier up, they sit like that. And then the yellow sort of crane structures you can see on the barrier itself, they lift them like that when you need the barrier to come up. Now, there is a space between the bottom of the cylinder and the bottom of the river, so you can still get water through, because obviously you don't want the full force just smacking into something. That would damage it very quickly. So yes, that's quite interesting how it's done. Lifespan, it was originally intended to last until about 2030. In recent times, they've actually looked at it again and said, actually, even with climate change and rising sea levels, we can actually make it last longer than that. So I think the current lifespan is up until about 2070 when it needs to be replaced. So yes, so that is stop 2, the Thames Barrier, and why London is where it is. And I shall see you at the next stop along. Bye for now. Well, here we are, stop 3. I am now in Greenwich. There's actually going to be a couple of stops in Greenwich, but the first one is here. So this is Maze Hill. Maze Hill Station is just down there. But I want to talk about this little building here, hidden behind this wall. I think this is probably about the best angle they'll get on it, unfortunately. So, but there we go. So this is Vanbrugh Castle. It was built as his home by Sir John Vanbrugh, the architect, playwright. He did a lot of things. So let's have a little look at John Vanbrugh then. So he has quite a wild youth. By 24, he's in prison in France. And eventually he gets moved to the Bastille. This is long, well, it's actually probably not that long until it falls, but he gets moved to the Bastille. He gets released from the Bastille at 29, and at that point he decides to settle down a bit. He decides he's not going to be running off gallivanting, getting involved in wars and all sorts of espionage shenanigans all over Europe. So he settled down in London. He becomes a very prominent member of the Kit Kat Club, which is a club of writers, men of letters, that sort of thing. And they all of the Whiggish persuasion, by which I don't mean they wore wigs, but Whig with an H, the political persuasion, the sort of likely liberal side, less conservative, more about parliamentary democracy if you go far enough, rather than absolute monarchy. He has a lot of distinguished fellows in that club. William Congreve, who we spoke about earlier down at Woolwich, the inventor of the Congreve rocket, he's a member of the Kit Kat Club. Joseph Addison, the founder of Spectator, and probably the most prominent member, and certainly the one I think you can argue has the most impact, is Sir Robert Walpole, who goes on to be generally to be considered the first Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He's the person who sort of defines the prime ministerial role, which up until him had been not really existed in the form we know it. So a member of the Kit Kat Club. He works for a while. He goes off and joins, and this is a little bit of a clue to one of the places we'll be going later. He goes off and joins the College of Arms as a herald. So he gets to wear a very fancy tabard and flouts around a lot. Then he sort of gives up on that, and he goes off and he starts writing plays. His plays they're very provocative. I think they were usually defined at the time as sexually frank. So there was quite a lot of all sorts of shenanigans going on in those as well as his early life. But yes, he runs the theatre on Haymarket for a little while. And then after a while of doing that, he decides, well, sod that for a lark, I'm going to become an architect. Which is quite constructing a narrative is not quite the same as constructing a building. Certainly if most authors came to me and said, I want to build your house, I think they would be out on their ear before they knew it. But nevertheless, he does, and he gets some very big commissions. His probably two most prominent buildings that he does are Castle Howard up in Yorkshire for the Earls of Carlisle. Remember the name Howard, because we will be encountering another member of the Howard dynasty shortly. And the other very big one he gets is Blenheim Palace for the Duke of Marlborough, the house that's or the palace that's constructed to celebrate the Duke of Marlborough's military victories on the continent. When he is building Blenheim Palace, he argues a lot with the Duchess of Marlborough, Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, who you may remember if you've seen The Favourite. Sarah of Marlborough is one of the competing favourites of Queen Anne. But they have very blazing rows, do Vanbrugh and Sarah Marlborough. If you want a very good account of that, Bill Bryson's At Home has a typically informative and entertaining account, which I would very much commend to you. So yes, but this is the house on Maze Hill in Greenwich that he builds for himself, Vanbrugh Castle. So yeah, there you go, that's our first stop in Greenwich. I'm going to just loop up the hill now and through Greenwich Park a little bit, and we'll talk a bit more there. And yes, I shall see you then. Right, here we are, stop 4. I have come up, as you may recognise it, from a couple of weeks ago actually, because I was up here a few weeks ago. This is Greenwich Park. I am next to, behind those trees over there, you can see the planetarium. That's the Royal Observatory, the Greenwich Royal Observatory. This is the Overlook, which is one of my favourite views in London. So yes, Royal Observatory over there. Built for John Flamsteed, the very first Astronomer Royal by Charles II, who appointed John Flamsteed to keep him up to date on matters astronomical. Quite a development really, because up until that point that sort of direct sponsorship of science wasn't quite so fashionable as certainly not in sort of northern European courts. It did happen, but it wasn't quite so prominent. We were more inclined still to astrologers and mystics and nonsense mongers at that point. So that was quite a step. It's still used actually for science. I mean, obviously you've got the Meridian line, which is just over there. It's about 30 metres, I suppose, in that direction. 1884, that was adopted as the prime meridian of the world, so the point from which all time either side was measured. Very important place in terms of the history of time, which is a fascinating subject in and of itself. Remind me to tell you about decimal time at some point, and I'll have to try and do something on time, I think, because it's a very interesting one. So yes, from up here we can see, if you look down there, that's the Queen's house, not the Queen's house, it's just called the Queen's house. I can't remember which Queen. Henrietta, I think, was Charles II's Queen, and the Royal National Maritime Museum on that side. Behind those trees, I hope to get into a position where you could see it, because usually you can, is the O2 Arena. Some of you who have been around as long as I have will remember it fondly as the Millennium Dome, back the great white elephant, really, of Blair's time in office. Although curiously, it was actually a Conservative idea before it was a Blairite one, which is interesting given how much hay the Tories made about it being a waste of money afterwards, but nevertheless. Other side of the river, you can just about see the river in the little gap there. Other side of the river is the Isle of Dogs. We don't actually know where the name Isle of Dogs comes from. It's first recorded in the letters and, letters and papers of Henry VIII, who records in his letters and papers that he bought a hose from for a ship that he had docked in the Isle of Dogs. We assume that was hose in the sense of hose pipe and not in the sense of trousers, because trying to fit a ship with trousers would have been excessive even for a Tudor monarch, but nevertheless. So yeah, we don't really know where the name comes from. There's a variety of speculations. Some people have suggested it might be satirical, based on the fact that people there were considered a bit wild and backward. Some people suggest it's after the dogs of some king. Edward II gets mentioned sometimes. Henry VII also gets mentioned there. Maybe it's about his dogs. The other speculation is it might be a corruption of another word, so it might have originally been the Isle of Ducks, for example, is one of the speculations. The other one being the Isle of Dykes. That's dykes as in ramparts built, earthen ramparts built to keep water out of places you don't want water in. Behind that, you have Canary Wharf there in the background. That's built on what was West India Docks. The greatest triumph probably of the West India Docks would be the launch of the SS Great Eastern by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. We talked earlier down at Woolwich about his father, Mark Isambard Brunel, and this is another example of the ways that London links things together. The industry and the trade and that sort of heritage is all tied together, and this walk particularly is very good for that. We're going to be coming back to it again and again and again. So yes, Canary Wharf itself is named after the fruit trade with the Canary Isles, Canary Islands that used to go out of West India Docks. When it was built, the City of London panicked because they thought that everyone would be rushing to Canary Wharf to go to office space. So the City of London underwent a massive programme of office building, building things above train stations and all sorts of things. and that meant that when Canary Wharf opened, it was kind of disappointing because everyone had already taken up their nice new offices in the city. So yes, a bit disappointing there. But yes, so that is Canary Wharf, the Isle of Dogs, Greenwich Park, and the Royal Observatory. And I shall see you shortly for stop number 5. Must be stop 5. I'll see you there. Well, it's a little further on. I've walked about 15 miles at this point, and I am here. Tower Bridge, you'll recognise there, and there's Tower of London, the White Tower behind it. So yes, Tower Bridge. Let's have a chat about Tower Bridge. So Tower Bridge is an interesting one. When it was first built, it was not very popular for several reasons. Firstly, it was not very popular aesthetically. People thought it looked tawdry, was the criticism they made. And they also used the phrase, what was it? They said it distracted from the facts of the structure. They seemed to not like the idea that it was a bridge what looked fancy. They just wanted it to be a functional bridge, which is a bit of an odd one, but nevertheless. It also became quite a popular. Originally, the upper walkways there were open at all times until they realised that they were becoming a haven for both pickpocketing and prostitution, and then they closed them. And they closed to this day for tickets only. On the basis, I suspect, that if you're willing to pay the price of a ticket, then you either deserve to be pickpocketed or prostituted. But nevertheless. But I also want to talk about some of the transport things that have happened to Tower Bridge, because it has various interesting things. So the first person to fly through the bridge, through the gap between the upper and lower walkways, is in 1912, as a chap who flies through it on a float plane. Stunt pilot. He then carries on down the Thames and flies under London Bridge, which is quite the endeavour even then. December 1952, the bridge, the bascules in the middle there, start to open while there is a bus going across them. And the bus driver has about an instant to decide what he's going to do about this, and he commits. He decides he's just going to put his foot down and go for it. And then he does. They make the leap. They manage to get over about a 3-foot gap. And he's given £10 by the City of London for his bravery and for his commitment to jumping over bridges in vehicles not designed to do so. 1968, a few years later, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the RAF. Now, there's no celebration of this planned, so one of the RAF pilots takes it into his own hands, and he flies a Hawker Hunter jet at 300 miles an hour through the bridge, carries on down the Thames past Parliament. Now, that's a hell of a thing to do in any sort of plane, but in a 300 mile an hour jet plane, that's a brave and quite stupid thing to do, and he is duly arrested as soon as he lands. Final one, a few years later, 1997, President Clinton is on his first state visit to the UK, and his motorcade is coming across from the south side of the Thames to the north, and it gets divided because the bridge goes up in the middle and splits it. Naturally, his security people aren't awfully keen on this and start complaining. And the management of the bridge say, well, we phoned the embassy, but they didn't answer the phone, so we weren't able to properly warn you. So there you go, there's a few little transportation-related facts. I was going to do a bit about, there's a Roman wall the other side of the tower itself, but I'll save that for the Roman tour of London, I think, so we'll do one of those at some point, because there's a lot of very interesting things there. So yes, that's Tower Bridge. I shall carry on. I'm switching over to the north side now, and I'm carrying on down that direction, and there's more interesting things down there, so we will resume later. Well, hello, this is stop number 6, maybe? Yes, 6, I think. So this bridge here is London Bridge. It's very plain these days, but London Bridge is worth stopping and having a little chat about, because London Bridge is very important, and it makes a very good place to talk a bit about the foundation of London. Partially that's because it's around here somewhere, not too far from here, that the river was first bridged. This is in about 47 AD, so about 3-4 years after the Romans invade. The pre-Roman tribes around here There were two of them. The first one was the Catavolani. The Catavolani later fall a bit to the Trinovantes. Tricovantes, I think, actually. But then the Romans come in, they bridge the Thames. And then what you get is you get on the north side, so on this side of the bridge, you get a little market town developing, and that becomes Londinium, and later expands into the City of London. And on that side, on the south side over there, you have Southwark starts to build up as a settlement. It's quite possible that the first Roman bridge was destroyed in Boudicca's revolt in AD 60. She burnt most of London to the ground, so it's quite probable that she did also take out the bridges as well. And then when the Romans leave in the 5th century, the bridges fall into disrepair anyway, and don't get immediately repaired. The Thames then becomes a bit of a borderland, really, a border area between Mercia and Wessex. Eventually it falls mostly into West Saxon hands, and Alfred the Great or Ethelred the Unready rebuild a bridge on this site, roughly on this site. We don't know which one it was. There are stories about both of them having done so. It's possible, of course, they both did, and there was another fall in the middle that we just don't know anything about. 1014, it gets destroyed again. That's to make sure, because at that point the Danes hold both Southwark and London, and the Saxons contrive to deprive them of river crossings so they can't effectively support each other across the river. And then that's not rebuilt again until 1066, just after the Norman conquest, where it's one of the very early things William the Conqueror does. But can you guess what happens next? Yes, that's right, 1136. It gets destroyed again, it gets burnt down this time. And then it's rebuilt again in the reign of King Stephen, who obviously I have a great fondness for, despite the fact he was a genuinely crap king. Henry II, not long after he realises what he's done with Archbishop Thomas Becket, where he has him murdered, he's very penitent, and one of the penitences he does is he builds another bridge on the site, and he founds a sort of monastic guild, essentially, called the Brothers of the Bridge, the Brethren of the Bridge, to look after it. The new bridge has a chapel in the middle dedicated to the memory of Thomas Becket. Oh, sorry, I murdered you, here's a bridge. I don't know whether he was particularly fond of bridges, but that's what he got. So yeah, that finishes building that in 1209, so he starts building in 1176, doesn't finish until 1209, so clearly medieval workmen were just as bad as modern day ones. In 1212, there's a big fire on the bridge which traps people on it. That eventually goes out and doesn't break down the bridge. It's one of the few fires that doesn't burn the whole thing to the ground. There's a partial collapse in 1281, at which point it's very clear that the maintenance is not being done very well. So 2 bridge wardens are appointed to oversee that in 1282, so just after the bridge, the partial collapse there. That version of the bridge is quite an interesting one. It has houses on it. The houses are about 10 or 11 foot wide. There's usually a shop or something on the ground floor, and then a little living area above it. Yeah, 10, 11 foot wide, they're not very big. There is actually a picture in the Museum of London. There is a painting of Old London Bridge with the house on it. It's quite a good painting, actually. It illustrates the point. But because of the construction of the bridge as well, there was often a big difference in the water level between this side and that side. And at times it was up to 6 foot. It could be quite heavy, and it was very difficult to navigate. And there was a saying at the time that it was for wise men to pass over and foolish men to pass under, because it was a very difficult one to navigate. So by the late 14th century, they'd managed to cram 140 houses on the bridge. Now, the river wasn't any wider than it is now, but they managed to get 140 houses on there. They eventually started bringing those together. There was a drawbridge at one end, which was used to display the heads of traitors. Prominent people you may have heard of whose heads were displayed there. William Wallace, the Scottish rebel, Jack Cade, Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell were also plonked up there when their time was up. 1633, there's a fire that destroys houses on the north side of the bridge, so up at this end, which actually is a saving grace, because when the Great Fire of London comes along in 1666, The fact that the houses are burnt down here essentially means it acts as a windbreak, as a fire break, so the fire doesn't spread to the south of the river. It stays mostly on the north. So actually, that fire kind of saved Southwark really from the Great One. So that's good. 1725, another fire. This time on the south side, burns down the houses. And in 1799, they finally realised, look, this bridge has been up since 1209. We could probably do with replacing it at some point. And so they hold a competition for the new bridge. This one is built in the 1820s. This is actually on the site of the new bridge. The old one was actually about 100 feet further down that way, I believe. But the problem is, this new bridge that was built in the 1820s, they very soon discover it's sinking. So that obviously doesn't work. So they decide they're going to have to build another new one, but they need to get rid of the old one first. So what do? Well, they sell it to an American. Of course you do. So they sell it to a man called Robert McCulloch for $2.46 million. There is a myth that McCulloch thought he was buying Tower Bridge because obviously it looks a lot more fancy. This is entirely a myth. He did know he was buying London Bridge, not Tower Bridge. He knew that. And so it's taken a rebuilt. So if you want to go and see the old London Bridge, you need to go to Arizona. It's in Arizona these days. So this bridge that was then built, this was opened in 1973, and yes, the nursery rhyme, you will all be from London Bridge is falling down, but yeah, etc, etc. I'm not going to do the whole thing. It's quite interesting because there's quite a lot of places, it turns out, that have nursery rhymes about bridges falling down. Of course, this one's fallen down a lot of times, so we don't know which one it refers to. The rhyme itself is first recorded in the 17th century, but I was rather delighted that one of these examples of songs in nursery rhymes in which bridges fall down is one from Denmark, which is called Nippelsbro Gar op Ogned. I hope you'll forgive my Danish pronunciation. I'm not quite that good at Danish, or as it turns out, English from that sentence, but nevertheless. So yes, so that is London Bridge. I'm now going to go about half a mile in that direction to find the next thing, which I'm very excited about. And then there will be, I think, one more after that, and then I'm going to have to go because I'm due in Putney and I'm going to have to hop on a tube. But there we go. So that was London Bridge. I will see you at the next destination point. So, our next stop is this very fancy gated building behind me here, which you probably can't see it because it's sort of behind the fence. This is the College of Arms. So the College of Arms, put that man there. The College of Arms is the body that regulates and deals with heraldry, matters of heraldry. And this is the point at which, if you're an American, this is going to make you think, yes, that's what Brits are. They're living in fantasy medieval land. Well, this is the building that really confirms that. So, the College of Arms deals with heraldry, it deals with genealogy. So if you want to find out your sort of family history, they can do that here. Though they tend to restrict it to armigerous people who have coats of arms. It also deals with the role of the peerage in the modern day, who is actually a sitting peer in the House of Lords, as opposed to just having a peerage, which isn't quite the same these days. Yes, it deals with all of those. If you want a coat of arms, you can get one. More or less anyone can get a coat of arms these days. It's about $7,000. It used to be 5. Obviously, the cost of ink has gone up. If you want a coat of arms, pay them $7,000 and they will give you one. It's run by the Earl Marshal. The Earl Marshal is a royal office. It's held by the Dukes of Norfolk. They're now the 18th Duke of Norfolk. It's a ceremonial office. He's one of the accepted peers. He's one of the only 2 hereditary peers who still sits in the House of Lords because of their hereditary peerage, rather than because they've been elected to sit there by the other hereditary peers. So yes, the College of Arms deals with England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Australia and New Zealand, and some other bits of the Commonwealth. It doesn't deal with Scotland. Scotland has its own one of these. It's called the Court of the Lord Lion. Yes, they're all strange names. This is what I mean about Americans thinking this is exactly what Britain's like. Well, here it is. The principal officers of the College of Arms, rather surprisingly, are kings.
Britain actually, at any point, even when we have a queen on the throne, has 3 kings. And they are the Kings of Arms, who are the chief officers of the College of Arms. There are 3 of them. The most senior is the Garter King of Arms, named after the Order of the Garter. There is then the Clarenceux King of Arms. The Clarenceux King of Arms deals with all matters south of the Trent River, which used to be the dividing line between north and south. That's probably a bit more arguable these days. Then there is the Ulster, the Norroy and Ulster King of Arms, who deals with anything north of the Trent and Northern Ireland. The College of Arms also has a secondary function, which is as the High Court of Chivalry. So the High Court of Chivalry is it's a full law court. It's got the same rights as any other court, more or less. And it deals with any matters where heraldry is contested, basically. So if somebody is using someone else's coat of arms, you could bring a case at the High Court of Chivalry, and the Earl Marshal, or more likely, because the Earl Marshal doesn't tend to be a lawyer, more likely he'll appoint a judge as his lieutenant to sit as his deputy to actually do the judging in the case. There aren't many lawyers who specialise in heraldic law these days, and in fact the Court of let these bikers go past. The High Court of Chivalry, the last time the High Court of Chivalry sat on a case was in 1954. It sat on a case called the City of Manchester Corporation against Manchester Palace of Varieties. And it was a case about the Manchester Palace of Varieties has been using Manchester Council, that's the corporation it used to be, it's now the council. They'd been using their coat of arms, and the council said they shouldn't have been because it made it look like they were affiliated with them. So yes, so that was the last time the High Court of Chivalry sat. That was the first time it had sat for 230 years. So the very first thing it had to do was rule on whether the court still existed, because it said, you know, they identify, well, nobody's actually abolished it. You know, its functions are still largely there. Some of its functions are now in different places or have been taken into other courts, but it's never formally been abolished. So the very first thing they had to decide before they could look at doing the actual case was they had to decide, do we actually still exist? Can we sit on this case? They decided they did. They said, you know, we haven't been abolished, we're still here, and there's no one else who can rule on these disputes, even if they only come up once every 230 years. So yes, that was it. I always feel it's a bit of a missed opportunity, really. It would have been nice for them to have ruled that they don't have the right to sit on it, because of course then they wouldn't have had the jurisdiction to make that assessment. So you'd have had a lovely little legal paradox. So I think a bit of a missed opportunity there. So yes, that is the College of Arms. Before this motorcyclist goes past, I'm going to see you. I will see you one more time just down the river. So I am in my usual haunt here in Westminster. I'm not in my usual place, which is over there in Parliament, but I'm over here at Westminster Abbey. Now I'm not actually going to be talking about Westminster Abbey, I'm going to be talking about Westminster School, which is behind the Abbey in the cloisters. Can't get very much closer than this, I'm afraid. So Westminster School, it's a fee-paying school, private school. Got a lot of very distinguished alumni from all over the place. But I wanted to talk about one of its less distinguished alumni, or also a rather peculiar historical fellow anyway. And this is a chap called Lancelot Blackburn. Now Lancelot Blackburn, I have my dates here. He was Archbishop of York between 1724 and 1743. He wasn't a very distinguished Archbishop of York, for reasons we will come to shortly. What makes him very distinctive is that before he was Archbishop of York, he was, at least in the popular telling of it, a pirate. So when he was born, he has a relatively regular upbringing, and then he disappears off to the West Indies for a number of years. And the popular story goes that while he was there, he fell in with pirates. Now, whether this was as a pirate or as a priest to pirates, we don't know, and in fact there's not much actual evidence that this did happen, or even that it didn't. I mean, there's no contradictory evidence either. There is a slightly mysterious thing though. He was paid £20, which back then was a reasonable amount of money, by King Charles II for secret services rendered about the time he was in the West Indies, so we don't really know what he was doing out there. But he it was clearly fairly well appreciated, this story, because it was mentioned. Even his colleagues of letters discussed it in public. Horace Walpole, the writer and the son of Sir Robert, who we encountered earlier when we were talking about Jean Vanbrugh and the Kit Kat Club, he wrote, "The jolly old Archbishop of York, who had all the manners of a man of quality, though he had been a buccaneer and was a clergyman, but he retained nothing of his first profession except his seraglio." And he wasn't a very good Archbishop of York. He was reputed to be a very carnal, venal man. He spent most of his time actually here in London rather than in York. He lived in Downing Street, which at the time was largely still private. And some people said that he was so carnal and immoral that he wasn't even fit to be a pirate, let alone Archbishop of York. And it might be where the story comes from. It might be a mistelling of that, or that could be off the back of it. There's a joke about him, he wasn't even fit to do that. He was at some point as well, he was ejected by a priest from church. This was while he was still Archbishop rather, because he demanded his pipe, some tobacco and some ale during a service, so he was thrown out of the church by the priest, which I can't see the current Archbishop of York doing anything like that. There was also a local legend in York, again not true, but there was a local legend that his butler was Dick Turpin. Yes, Lancelot Blackburn, interesting chap, interesting alumni of Westminster School, the Archbishop who was also a pirate. There we go. This will be the last one. I need to hop on the tube now to get down to Putney. I haven't managed to make it nearly as far as I thought I would, so I'll have to save my other exciting places for a future venue. So I hope you've enjoyed this little tour and a few interesting little things, and I'll see you soon for another Petit adventure. Bye for now.